Software engineer interviews are challenging. Technical interviews are difficult, and oftentimes it's hard to articulate ideas verbally when they're about very, very complex and technical things. It's why I'm trying to create content around system design on this channel because I think that that's one of the more difficult aspects once you break into the later stages of the interview process because I think it's hard to talk about system design in a succinct way verbally. I'm a visual learner, so when I don't have visual tools at my disposal that I can draw, sometimes I can get lost in my words, and sometimes that I find myself repeating things that I didn't intend to repeat. And system design, there's so many components to it. There's so many abstract words and all these phrases and just different terminology in general that goes along with creating a system. And sometimes it's hard to create that like mental checklist in your head of all the points that you need to cover. Because it's one thing in a technical interview when you have code that you can see, you can, do trial and error, you can do all these things. But when you have just a verbal assessment of your skills and you're talking through a system, it's harder to backtrack because once you say it, you kind of, you already said it. There's no delete function to what you say verbally in an interview. And it begins to look like you don't know what you're talking about if you continually backtrack and you repeat yourself. And so I find that it's imperative that you practice just like this. You practice in front of a camera to make sure that you are able to tell that story of system design because it really is a story, right? You need to introduce the characters, which are the components of the system. You need the plot, which is the function of the system, and you need the conclusion to say, okay, this is how the data is going to move through the system, and here are my recommendations for how I'm going to leave the system and what we can improve on in the future. So it's up to you if you decide to leave it on a cliffhanger. A cliffhanger is, okay, I recognize that we create a potential bottleneck with this queue and the service. We may need to introduce more queues, or we may need to further break down this system into smaller components. And so it's up to you to leave it as such, but it's your responsibility to make sure that your interviewer knows your thought process and where you intended to go if you do run out of time. When I was interviewing earlier on at the start of my career, so this was about 6 years ago, I didn't understand that it's not about creating the perfect answer. A lot of it is about crafting how you're going about solving the problem. You're trying to tell that story. When you're given a problem, I know for me, it's very easy for me to look at it and kind of freeze up. Not I get so hung up on the minute details that I forget the larger picture at hand. If I'm given a problem that tells me that I need to, let's say I'm just going to, make a generic example, but if I'm given a list of numbers and I have to filter out a specific number, sometimes it's easy to immediately begin thinking of all the edge cases and all the everything that can go wrong. But when you're doing that, when you're thinking through all these possibilities and you haven't written anything down and you haven't started code, it's easy to get lost and then never actually make any progress. So you spent the first 10 minutes not really even doing anything. I found that it's easier to start with what you think you're going to do and talk about it as you're going through it, but at least then you have a starting point because you need a starting point for yourself. You need a point of reference, right? Because if we go in Visual Studio, to make a loop, you can just do 4 tab and it creates it for you. In an interview scenario, you're not going to have all the tooling that you have typically at your disposal in an IDE like Visual Studio. So you have to create that templated boilerplate code for yourself. And it's imperative that you get that done early on because I feel like that not only will jog your memory into how to structure whatever logic you're trying to do or whatever loop, but it's going to help you through the conversation because I know for me, I've had interview experiences where I have just gotten stuck because I failed to just put something on paper, just write it down. And I got so wrapped up in my head and I was so worried about all these like obscure edge cases and I kept on asking, like, oh, what if this, what if that? And I kept on like double checking the prompt and everything. And before I knew it, like 15 minutes had passed and I haven't written any code. So I've lost 15 minutes of the interview where I could have been refactoring and asking more coherent questions about the code that I put on the paper. And that's so vital and that's so difficult to understand because it's different than taking a test, right? Because in a test, especially if it's multiple choice, you just pick an answer, right? If it's an essay prompt, you have to begin writing the essay, but you know that you have to begin writing. Sometimes I feel like code is so it can get tricky because we try to look at it and we try to craft the perfect solution in our head before we put anything down on paper, or at least that's what I do. And that every time I've tried to do that, I've always done poorly in the interview. And I've always done better when I've just started, when I've just begun to write something. And that is a very, very difficult skill that I found hard to master, to fully get down. And even years after when I initially was doing my interviews, I still found it challenging. And I felt like I needed practice. So honestly, the best thing to do is just get a scratch piece of paper with nothing on it and then find a prompt somewhere, look up like interview questions or whatever for system design or software engineering, whatever it is. Just find a question and then just get into the practice of something, writing something down and creating your starting point because creating your starting point is so easy or easy is so difficult to do. It's difficult to create your starting point because when I opened Visual Studio or Rider, Visual Studio Code, whatever, all that stuff has so much templated stuff out for you that it's easy to take for granted the starting point that it offers you. And a lot of times when you go into an interview, you don't even realize how much you have taken for granted in terms of the starting points that the tools give you. And so for me, I remember one time I remember very well. One time it was a basic problem and I just had to write a for loop. And I had gotten into such a habit of just taking advantage of autocomplete that I literally stumbled on writing a basic for loop in C sharp. And again, it's just because I would just in Visual Studio 4 tab tab and it completes the syntax. I just, for whatever reason, because of the stress of the interview and because I had taken for granted the starting points that I had been afforded in the IDEs, I just froze. I just got to like the middle the middle part of the condition and I just was like, "Oh, wait, do I have to define the variable?" I just was like messing up and it looked super bad. And needless to say, I did not get that opportunity. This was, oh, I remember this, that was like 4 years ago. And I still remember it because it was, I felt really embarrassed. And I felt like I just was a failure. I felt like I didn't know how to code. And that really was a big hit for my confidence and my just, it made me feel like I was not like equipped at all to do this job. My imposter syndrome was like to the max at that point. And again, I just failed. And after that, I realized that I needed to study a lot more. But now, I look back at it some 4-ish years later, and I really see that as a very valuable learning experience for me because you need to have failures in life in order to grow, in order to, just be a better, be a better student in life, right? You need to have failures. If you don't have failures, you're never going to learn from your mistakes. And that's just part of life is learning from your mistakes so you can continue to grow and get better. And that's just part of life. And it's no different in software engineering, right? I continually say on this channel that I believe that you really need to sit down, record yourself doing an interview and then watch it back and then just continually do that for years and years because I feel like each time you're just going to get better. And it's so important because I look back at all my failed interviews and I look back at all my failed attempts at technical assessments and everything. And I can so clearly see where I went wrong and I can so clearly see my mistakes. And I think about that and I feel like had I studied and prepared better, and had I actually taken the time to start from scratch on a piece of paper, I would have done a lot better. Because I sometimes can deceive myself into thinking that, whenever I pull up like practice problems online, whether it's Leak Code or whether, whatever it is, I start those assessments. But then, I open up another tab and I look something up, right? And in my mind, I'm like, well, I'm only looking something up. Like I kind of know this already, but I'm just double checking, and then I'll go back and finish it. But I'm not. I didn't know it. I had to look it up, but I convinced myself that I already knew it, and I was just verifying so I could get it right on this this problem set. And that's not true. And I that has come to get me in interviews because I'm like, wait a second, I just forgot. I just forgot basic syntax, or I forgot to how to problem solve. And freezing in an interview is a real thing. I've had it happen on numerous occasions, and it's scary, and it's very scary because whenever you pull up that technical interview, whenever you are in that interview and you scan the problem, or you get the question asked to you, within like a second and a half, you pretty much know if you know it or you don't. It just something just hits you, and I've had it where I just knew that I didn't know how to do it and I just froze, and I spent the next 30, 45 minutes fumbling my way to create some answer. And it's just the worst feeling ever, right? It is the absolute worst feeling, but it is inevitable. It's unavoidable that that's going to happen. And that's okay because it's a learning opportunity, it's a learning experience, and it's something that I feel like we all have to go through in software development. It's kind of like a rite of passage at this point, is to fail technical interviews and to freeze and to just give bad answers because we're people, we're human. We can't be perfect. And it's all part of the journey in the process, and it's so vital. And again, I look back at all those failed experiences as positives now. I see them as good things because I can learn from them and grow from them. And so as I'm creating this system design series content, I want it to be valuable for everybody. I want it to be something that we can use as a learning tool, but also I want to get across the problem solving nature the best I can. And are they going to be perfect? Of course not. These systems that we're going to mock up on the channel, these problems that we're going to work through, and all the material related to the system design series playlist that we have on this channel, it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be much better resources, but the one thing that I want to get across is just the general problem solving conversation, and I want it to be as raw, unedited as possible because I feel like that's where we're going to grow from, and that's where we're going to get value, is just getting used to having these conversations and to see what it looks like to actually talk through how to make something in just a casual setting, right? These aren't interviews, these aren't professional presentations. This is just me making content about system design the best I can. And again, I would recommend reading as many books as you can, and continually studying and reading and watching tutorials, because it's only going to help you grow. And I really, really hope this channel can be a valuable tool and can help anyone who watches this to not only get a job, but feel like they're part of some kind of community. It's very important. So that's all I got for today, and I'll see you in the next one.